bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. Hello and welcome back to Wickedshizuku's Reviews. This is episode 97. And I will be continuing on Tuesday's playlist with American literature. And today's section is Stories of the Beginning of the World. Stories about the creation of the world tell people who they are by telling them where they come from. Native American creation stories, although never written down or gathered into a Bible, serve for native cultures in much the same way as the book of Genesis serves for the Judeo-Christian world. They posit a general cultural outlook and offer perspectives on life and how to understand it. All native peoples have stories of the earliest times, anthologized here and there. Here are three, one from the Iroquois of the northeast and two from the Pima of the southwest. These peoples encountered European explorers, missionaries, and colonists very early in the period of contact, and information and conjecture about the Iroquois and the Pima appear in European texts that go back almost 400 years. But these early records offer only bare sketches of what the native people said, sang, chanted, and narrated, and of course, North American Indians did not themselves write down their stories. It was not until the end of the mid to late 19th century that Euro-Americans developed the linguistic skills and cultural understanding necessary to translate and transcribe Native American creation stories in a manner that begins to do justice to them. It was not until this time that Native people collaborated extensively in recording the myths and legends of their people. In the Southwest, the Army doctor Washington Matthews began to work on the Navajo night chant and mountain chant in the 1880s, while Franklin Hamilton Cushing, employed by the Bureau of American Ethnology, had installed himself among the Zuni and begun to record their legends in 1879. J.W. Fuchs, after the turn of the century, and J.W. Lloyd, somewhat later, both worked with the Pima Indians, known as Thin Leather. They worked with the Pima Indian known as Thin Leather to record stories of the earliest times. Among the Iroquois, David Cusick, a Tuscarora, the Tuscarora joined the Iroquois Confederacy early in the 18th century, had begun to document the legends of his people as early as 1825. He was followed by the distinguished Tuscarora anthropologist M.B. Hewitt shortly after the turn of the century. For all the admirable labors of these Native American and Euro-American people, it is possible to say with assurance whether one or another of the stories they recorded is more ancient or more authentic, more true to indigenous narrative practice before the arrival of the Europeans. And while the stories do change with time and circumstance because of the oral tradition favors continuity, it seems reasonable to turn to later accounts for a window on what came before. The Iroquois creation story. The people known as the Iroquois were made up of the Mohawk, Seneca, Oneida, Onondaga, and Cayuga nations, joined in the early 18th century by the Tuscarora of North Carolina. The Five Nations became the Six Nations. The original Five Nations occupied lands that ranged from the area northeast of Lakes Ontario and Erie, around the St. Lawrence and Ottawa rivers, then south of the woodlands. Then south of the lakes and eastward, almost to the Hudson River. These inhabitants of the eastern woodlands spoke Algonquian languages, and it was an unidentified Algonquian word that early French explorers seized on to coin the term Iroquois. Dutch and English settlers called all of these peoples Mohawk, Makwa, and Seneca. The Iroquois, whose towns contained as many as 2,000 people, called themselves people of the Longhouse, in reference to their primary type of dwelling. Iroquois longhouses were some 20 feet wide and some 40 to 200 feet long, accommodating several families who shared cooking fires. Warfare was an important element of Iroquois life. Late in the 15th century, in response to the terrible consequences of ongoing wars, a man named Hiawatha founded the League or Confederacy of the Five Nations. According to Iroquois legend, having lost all of his daughters in war, Hiawatha, in a rage of grief and despair, went by himself into the forest. There he encountered a supernatural being named, Dega Nawida, the Peacemaker, perhaps a reincarnation of the good twin of the Iroquois creation story. Dega Nawida comforted Hiawatha and taught him rituals of condolence that were to be the core of a new creed, the good news of peace and power. Thus, the cultural ideal of peace was established. While war continued as a central reality of Iroquois life, there were now ritual means of comforting the bereaved and an ongoing hope for more lasting peace. Of special note is the importance of women in Iroquois life. Women owned the property and took responsibility for major decisions of social life. Indeed, society is referred to as sheep, attending to the agricultural duties in the clearings, while the men hunted in the woods or warred against traditional enemies such as the fierce Huron to the north. The principal male figure in the Iroquois child's life was not the father, but the mother's brother, and the image of mother-dominated families is established strongly in the creation legend. In the version printed here, males are entirely absent at the beginning of the tale, appearing neither as husbands nor as fathers. Indeed, stories of fatherless boys who become heroes are common in Iroquois folk history. The Iroquois creation myth exists in some 25 versions, the earliest of which was taken down by the Frenchman Gabriel Sagard in 1623 from the Huron, near neighbors and enemies of the Five Nations. Other early accounts derive from the Mohawk and the Seneca. There is, however, no actual transcription and translation of an Iroquois cosmonic myth, a narrative of the establishment of the world until that of David Cusick, a Tuscarora in the 19th century. Little is known about Cusick. He was born in Madison County, New York before 1800, when his family moved to the lands granted to Tuscarora by the Seneca and Oneida in Niagara County, New York. Most likely he attended a mission school where he learned to read and write English. He died in 1840. Cusick's Tuscarora version shares many elements with the creation stories of other members of the Iroquois League. Indeed, it has surely been influenced by them, but also omits such material that other versions include. Other accounts begin with a man and a woman who live together in the sky world on opposite sides of a fire. Although these two do not sleep together, the woman finds herself pregnant and eventually gives birth to a daughter. The man falls ill and dies, and the daughter grieves intensely for him. When the young woman is grown, her father's spirit instructs her to make a difficult journey to a place where she will meet a man destined to become her husband. When at last she finds this man, he is too ill, but the young woman cures him. The two marry, but do not sleep together. Nonetheless, as had happened to her mother, she becomes pregnant. It is at this point that Cusick picks up the story of the woman who would have the twin born. Other versions continue past the point where Cusick terminates. Some tell, for example, of a toad that hoards water long enough for a flood to burst from its belly or armpit, an ingenious account of a flood, uninfluenced by the Judeo-Christian account. Cusick's English, as the phrase quoted above makes clear, is not standard. Aware of that, he noted in the preface to his work that he found himself so small educated that it was impossible for me to compose the work without much difficulty. His style is a curious combination of an Indian-inflected English and what the Euro-American culture of the period would have defined as polite literary style. We have selected Cusick's version of the Iroquois creation story because it is early, because it is by a native person. Cusick was the first Native American to record on his own the founding myths of his own people, and because it is fairly accessible to the contemporary reader. Okay, all right, now on to the Iroquois creation story. From Sketches of the Ancient History of the Six Nations, 1827. So there's a lot of footnotes in here. I'm just going to read straight on through. I'm not going to read footnotes. Let's see. I'll read the footnotes afterwards. Okay, so the Iroquois creation story. A tale of the foundations of the great island, now North America, the two infants born, and the creation of the universe. Among the ancients were two worlds in existence. The lower world was in great darkness, the possession of the great monster. But the upper world was inhabited by mankind, and there was a woman conceived, and would have the twin born. When her travail drew near, and her situation seemed to produce a great distress on her mind, and she was induced by some of her relations to lay herself on a mattress which was prepared as to gain refreshments to her wearied body. But while she was asleep, the very place sunk down towards the dark wood. The monsters of the great water were alarmed at her appearance of descending to the lower world. In consequence, all the species of the creatures were immediately collected into where it was expected she would fall. When the monsters were assembled, and they made consultation, one of them was appointed in haste to search the great deep, in order to procure some earth, if it could be obtained. Accordingly, the monster descends, which succeeds and returns to the place. Another requisition was presented, who would be capable to secure the woman from the terrors of the great water. But none was able to comply, except a large turtle came forward and made proposal to them to endure her lasting weight, which was accepted. The woman was yet descending from a great distance. The turtle executes upon the spot, and a small quantity of earth was vanished on the back part of the turtle. The woman alights on the seat prepared, and she receives a satisfaction. While holding her, the turtle increased every moment, and became a considerable island of earth, and apparently covered with small bushes. The woman remained in a state of unlimited darkness, and she was overtaken by her travail, to which she was subject. While she was in the limits of distress, one of the infants in her womb was moved by an evil opinion, and he was determined to pass out under the side of the parent's arm, and the other infant in vain endeavored to prevent his design. The woman was in a painful condition during the time of their disputes, and the infants entered the dark world by compulsion, and their parent expired in a few moments. They had the power of sustenance without a nurse, and remained in the dark regions. After a time, the turtle increased to the great island, and the infants were grown up, and one of them possessed with a gentle disposition, and named Inigo the good mind. The other youth possessed an insolence of character, and was named the bad mind, Iniganha Pitgaya. The good mind was not contented to remain in a dark situation, and he was anxious to create a great light in the dark world. But the bad mind was desirous that the world should remain in a natural state. The good mind determines to prosecute his designs, and therefore commences the work of creation. At first, he took the parent's head, the deceased, of which he created an orb, and established it in the center of the firmament, and it became of the very superior nature to bestow light to the new world, now the sun. And again he took the remnant of the body, and formed another orb, which was inferior to the light, now moon. In the orb a cloud of legs appeared to prove it was the body of the good mind. Parent. The former was to give the light to the day, and the latter to the night. Then he also created numerous spots of light, now stars. These were to regulate the days, nights, seasons, years, etc. And whenever the light extended to the dark world, the monsters were displeased, and immediately concealed themselves in the deep places, lest they should be discovered by some human beings. The good man continued the works of creation, and he formed numerous creeks and rivers on the great island, and then created numerous species of animals of the smallest and the greatest to inhabit the forests, and the fishes of all kinds to inhabit the waters. And when he had made the universe, he was in doubt respecting some being to possess the great island, and he formed two images of the dust of the ground in his own likeness, male and female. And by his breathing into their nostrils he gave them the living souls, and named them Agahau, the real people. And he gave the great island all the animals of game for their maintenance, and he appointed thunder to water and the earth by frequent rains, agreeable of the nature of the system. This is the island became after this, the island became fruitful, and vegetation afforded the animals subsistence. The bad mind, while his brother was making the universe, went throughout the island and made numerous high mountains and falls of water and great steeps, and also creates various reptiles which would be injurious to mankind. But the good mind restored the island to its former condition. The bad mind proceeded further in his motives, and he made two images of clay in the form of mankind. But while he was giving them existence, they became apes. And when he had not the power to create mankind, he was envious against his brother, and again he made two of clay. The good mind discovered his brother's contrivances, and aided in giving them living souls. It is said had the most knowledge of good and evil. The good mind now accomplishes the works of creation, notwithstanding the imaginations of the bad mind were continually evil, and he attempted to enclose all the animals of game in the earth, so as to deprive from all of mankind. But the good mind released them from confinement. The animals were dispersed, and traces of them were made on the rocks near the cave where it was closed. The good mind experiences that his brother was at variance with the works of creation, and feels not disposed to favor any of his proceedings, but gives admonitions of his future state. Afterwards, the good mind requested his brother to accompany him, as he was proposed to inspect the game, etc. But when the short distance from their Monina residence, the bad mind became so unmanly that he could not conduct his brother any more. The bad mind offered a challenge to his brother, and resolved that who gains the victory should govern the universe, and appointed a day to meet the contest. The good mind was willing to submit to the offer, and he enters reconciliation and with his brother, which he falsely mentions that by whipping with flags would destroy his temporal life. And he earnestly solicits his brother also to notice the instrument of death, which he manifestly relates by the use of deer horns. Beating his body, he would expire on the day appointed. The engagement commenced, which lasted for 2 days, after pulling up the trees and mountains as the track of a terrible whirlwind. At last the good mind gained the victory by using the horns, as mentioned, the instrument of death, which he succeeded in deceiving his brother, and he crushed him in the earth. And the last words uttered from the bad mind were that he would have equal power over the souls of mankind after death, and he sinks down to eternal doom, and became the evil spirit. After this tumult, the good mind repaired to the battleground, and then visited the people, and retires from the earth. So there really wasn't much that you shouldn't be able to actually understand in that. But that's pretty much it. That's the Iroquois creation story, and I will be right back after this break. And since we were on the topic of the Iroquois nation, I thought I would just skip ahead just one story in our book of Brave Deeds, because that story is about Pocahontas. So let's go ahead and get to it. It's pretty short and only a few pages and a few pictures. Pocahontas, from Captain John Smith's narration. At last I was ushered into the presence of Powhatan, and found him seated before a fire on a seat somewhere resembling a bedstead, covered with a great robe made of raccoon skins, with all the tails hanging thereto. On neither hand did sit a young wench of 16 or 18 years, and along each side of the house were 2 rows of men, and behind them as many women, all with their heads and shoulders painted red. Many of their heads were bedecked with the white down of birds, but every one wore something in the hair, and with a great chain of white beads about their necks. When I made my entrance before the king of all the people, and gave a great shout, and to do me honor, the queen of Appomattox was appointed to bring me water, wherewith I might wash my hands, and another brought me a bunch of feathers, wherewith to dry them, instead of a towel. And then they feasted me in the best manner they could, which after all was but barbarous. Then they held great consultations about me, which I could not altogether understand, but the conclusion was was that I was to die, a fate which, in truth, was near coming to pass, but for God's goodness, as you shall hear, and indeed it did seem as if my last hour was at hand, for many of the savages, as could, laid hold of me, and having brought two great stones, which they had placed before Powhatan, they dragged me to them, and laid my head thereon, making ready with their clubs to beat my brains out. But now, mark of mercy of God towards me when in this evil case, for surely it was his handiwork, their clubs were raised, and in another moment I should have been dead, when Pocahontas, the king's dearest daughter, a child of 10 years old, finding no entreaties could prevail to save me, darted forward, and taking my head in her arms, laid her own upon it, and thus prevented my death. She thus claimed me as her own, and for her sake Powhatan was contented that I should live, and that I should henceforth spend my time in making him hatchets and bells and beads, and copper ornaments for Pocahontas. They made no manner of doubt, but that I could make all these things, for in that country the men are of all the handcrafts, nay, even the king himself will make his own robes, shoes, bows, and arrows, or pots, plant, hunt, and do the same as his subjects. So, as I said, that was pretty short, and here is the picture that is embossed. And there's Powhatan. And that was our brave deed, so join me later to come back for some H.G. Wells. All right, and I'm back. I need to change my glasses out real quick, though, because I can actually hold this book up. So, different glasses for different things. Gotta love the diabetes. So, we're going into H.G. Wells' History of the World, Volume 1. And we are on Chapter 4, The Age of Reptiles now. So, I think I'm just going to read Section 1 and 2, which is The Age of Lowland Life, and 2 is going to be Dragons. So, let's see. 1. The Age of Lowland Life. We know that for many millions of years that the wetness and warmth, the shallow lagoon conditions that made possible the vast accumulations of vegetable matter, which, compressed and mummified, are now coal, prevailed over most of the world. There were some cold intervals, it is true, but they did not last long enough to destroy the growths. Then that long age of luxuriant, low-grade vegetation drew to its end, and for a time life on Earth seems to have undergone a period of worldwide bleakness that concludes what we may call Part 1, by far the longest part in the history of life on this planet. When the story resumes again after this arrest at the end of the Paleozoic era, we find life entering upon a fresh phase of richness and expansion. Vegetation has made great advances in the art of living out of water, while the Paleozoic plants of the coal measures probably grew with swamp water flowing over their roots. The Mesozoic flora from its very outset included palm-like cycads and low-ground conifers that were distinctly land plants growing on soil above the water level. The lower levels of the Mesozoic land were no doubt covered by great fern brakes and shrubbery brush and a kind of jungle growth of trees. But there existed as yet no grass, no turf or greensward, and no flowering plants at all, great or small. Probably the Mesozoic was not an age of very brightly colored vegetation, but must have had a flora green in the wet season and brown and purple in the dry. Probably it was not nearly so beautiful as the woods and thickets of today. There were no gay flowers, no bright autumn tints before the fall of the leaf, because there was as yet no fall of the leaf, and beyond the lower levels the world was still barren, still unclothed, still exposed, without any mitigation to the wear and tear of the wind and rain. When one speaks of conifers in the Mesozoic, the reader must not think of the pines and firs that clothe the high mountain slopes of our time. He must think of lowland evergreens. The mountains were still as bare and as life as ever. The only color effects among the mountains were the color effects of naked rock, and such colors as make the landscapes of Colorado so marvelous today. Amidst the spreading vegetation of the lower plains, the reptiles were increasingly mightily in multitude and variety. They were now, in many cases, absolutely land animals. There are numerous anatomical points of distinction between a reptile and an amphibian. They held good between such reptiles and amphibians as prevailed in the Carboniferous time of the Upper Paleozoic. But the fundamental difference between reptiles and amphibians, which matters in this history, is that the amphibian must go back to the water to lay its eggs, and that in the early stages of its life it must live in and underwater. The reptile, on the other hand, has cut out all the tadpole stages from its life cycle. Or, to be more exact, its tadpole stages are got through before the young leave the egg case. The reptile has come out of the water altogether. Some had gone back to it again, just as the hippopotamus, I've never seen it spelled like that, wow, and otter among mammals have gone back. But that is a further extension of the story. That is a detail and a complication to which we cannot give much attention to this outline. In the Paleozoic period, as we have said, life has not spread beyond the swampy river valleys and the borders of the sea lagoons and the loch. But in the Mesozoic, life was growing ever more accustomed to the thinner medium of the air, was sweeping boldly up over the plains and towards the hillsides. It is well for the student of human history and the human future to note that if a disembodied intelligence with no knowledge of the future had come to Earth and studied life during the early Paleozoic age, he might very reasonably have concluded that life was absolutely confined to the water and that it could never spread over the land. It found a way. In the later Paleozoic period, that the visitant might have been equally sure that life could not go beyond the edge of the swamp. The Mesozoic period would still have found him setting bounds to life far more limited than the bounds that are set today. And so today, though we mark how life and men are still limited to 5 miles of air and a depth of perhaps a mile or so of sea, we must not conclude from that present limitation that life, though man may not presently spread out and up and down to a range of living as yet inconceivable. The earliest known reptiles were beasts with great bellies and not very powerful legs, very like their kindred amphibia, wallowing as the crocodile wallows to this day. But in the Mesozoic, they soon began to stand up and go stoutly on all fours, and several great sections of them began to balance themselves on tail and hind legs, rather as the kangaroos do now, in order to release the forelimbs for grasping food. The bones of one notable division of reptiles, which retained a quadrupedal habit, a division of which many remains have been found in South African and Russian early Mesozoic deposits, display a number of characters which approach those of the mammalian skeleton. And because of this resemblance to the mammal's beast, this division is called the Theriomorpha, beast-like. Another division was the crocodile branch, and another developed towards the tortoises and turtles. The plesiosaurs and I can't even pronounce that. Ichthyosaurs were two groups which have left no living representatives. They were huge reptiles returning to a whale-like life in the sea. Phalosaurus, one of the largest plesiosaurs, measured 30 feet from the snout to tail tip, of which half was neck. The mosasaurs were a third group of great porpoise-like marine lizards. But the largest and most diversified group of the Mesozoic reptiles was a very group known as dinosaurs, many of which attained quite enormous proportions. In bigness, these greater dinosaurs have never been exceeded, although the sea can still show in the whales creatures as great. Some of these, and the largest among them, were herbivorous animals. They browsed on the brushy vegetation and among the ferns and bushes, or they stood up and grasped trees with their forelegs while they devoured the foliage. Among the browsers, for example, was the Diplodocus carnegie, 2 eyes, which measured 84 feet in length. The Brachiosaurus was still more colossal. It had a live weight of about 50 tons. Still larger bones are appearing. These great monsters had legs, and they are usually figured as standing up on them, but it is very doubtful if they could have supported their weight in this way out of water. The bones end in cartilage. The joints are not very strong. Buoyed up by water or mud, these monsters could have got along very well. The ordinary big dinosaur has bulky lower body and lower limbs, which were probably almost always submerged or floating. Neck, head, and forelimbs are much lighter in structure. These were probably kept out of water. Another noteworthy type of dinosaur was the Triceratops, a reptilian parallel of the hippopotamus, but with a rhinoceros-like horn. There were also a number of great flesh eaters who preyed upon the herbivores. Of these, Tyrannosaurus seems almost the last word in frightfulness. Among living things, some species of this genus measured 40 feet from snout to tail. Apparently, it carried this vast body kangaroo fashion on its tail and hind legs. Probably, it reared itself up. Some authorities even supposed that it leapt through the air. If so, it possessed muscles of quite miraculous quality. A leaping elephant would be far less astounding idea. Much more probably, it waded half submerged in pursuit of herbivores, saurians. It may have fought out its kills in channels and sheets of water, like the Norfolk Broads or the Everglades of Florida. So, let's see. Okay, let's start with this one. I miss my paper can. If anybody wants to contribute to the channel, like, subscribe, and share now at this time. And, if you want to donate, just give me a DM or something so I can get a new paper cam and maybe a new office chair. Would just be fucking fantastic, people. I really love you. Do you see? Do you see? This is the H.G. Wells History of the World, Volume 1. Okay, so dragons. Here we go. One special development of the dinosaurian type of reptile was a light, hopping, climbing group of creatures which developed a bat-like web between the fourth finger and the side of the body, which was used in gliding from tree to tree after the fashion of the flying squirrels. These bat lizards were pterodactyls. They are often described as flying reptiles. The pictures are drawn of the Mesozoic scenery, in which they are all seen soaring and swooping about, but the breastbone has no keel, such as the breastbone of the bird has, or the attachment of muscles strong enough for long sustained flying. They must have flitted about like bats. They must have had a grotesque resemblance to the heraldic dragons, and they played the part of bat-like birds in the Mesozoic jungles. But bird-like though they were not birds, nor ancestors of birds. The structure of their wings was altogether different from that of birds. The structure of their wings was that of a hand with one long finger and a web. The wing of a bird is like that of an arm, with feathers projecting from its hind edge. And these pterodactyls, so far as we know, had no feathers. The feather is very specialized skin structures, which was developed only once in the evolution of life. Well, goddamn. That was really interesting. But I think that we will continue with the Age of Reptiles next Tuesday reading, okay? And after this break, I will see you for Eothen chapter 11, where they're going through Galilee. Welcome to Wickedshizuku's Reviews, bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. Well, hello and welcome back, everyone. This is Wickedshizuku's Reviews, episode 97, and I will be continuing with our Tuesday reads with Eothen, and we will be going into chapter 10 this time around. So, if you're new here and you want to listen to this from the very beginning, go back to episode 2 in the playlist, and you shall go with every multiple of 2 on Tuesday. On Tuesday read will be Eothen, or A Brave Deed, or the others that go along. American Literature is also another one that we do on Tuesdays, and H.G. Wells, History of the World. So, we shall continue with chapter 10. Alright, so let's get into it. Chapter 10, The Monks of Palestine. Whenever you come back to me from Palestine, we will find some golden wine, vino d'oro of Lebanon, that we may celebrate with the apt libations, the monks of the Holy Land. And through the poor fellows, to be theoretically dead to the world, we will drink to every man of them a good long life, and a merry one. Graceless is the traveler who forgets his obligations to these saints upon the earth. Little love has he for merry Christendom, if he has not rejoiced with great joy to find, in the very midst of the water-drinking infidels, those lowly monasteries where the blessed juice of the grape is quaffed in peace. Aye. We will fill our glasses till they look like cups of amber, and drink profoundly to our gracious hosts in Palestine. Christianity permits this and sanctions the drinking of wine, and of all the holy brethren in Palestine, there are none who hold fast to this gladsome rite so strenuously as the monks of Damascus. Not that they are more zealous Christians than the rest of their fellows in the Holy Land, but that they have better wine. Whilst I was in Damascus, I had my quarters at the Franciscan convent there, and very soon after my arrival, I asked one of the monks to let me know something of the spots that deserved to be seen. I had my inquiry in reference to the associations with which the city had been hallowed by the sojourn and adventures of St. Paul. There is nothing in all Damascus, said the good man, half so well worth seeing as our cellars. And forthwith he invited me to go see and admire the long range of liquid treasure that he and his brethren had laid up for themselves on earth. And these, I soon found, were not as the treasures of the miser that lie in unprofitable disuse. For the day by day, and hour by hour, the golden juice ascended from the dark recesses of the cellar to the utmost brains of the friars. Dear old fellows, in the midst of that solemn land, their Christian laughter rang loudly and merrily. Their eyes kept flashing with joyful fire, and their heavy woolen petticoats could no more weigh down the springiness of their paces than the filmy gauze of a danseuse can clog her bounding step. Dances can clog her bounding step. You could be likely enough to fancy that these monastics are men who have retired to the sacred sites of Palestine from an enthusiastic longing to devote themselves to the exercise of religion in the midst of the very land on which its first seeds were cast. And this is partially, at least, the case with the monks of the Greek Church, but it is not with the enthusiasts that the Catholic establishments are filled. The monks of the Latin convents are chiefly persons of the peasant class from Italy and Spain, who have been handed over to these remote asylums by the order of their ecclesiastical superiors, and can no more account for their being in the Holy Land than men of marching regiments can explain why they are in stupid quarters. I believe that these monks are for the most part well conducted, men punctual in their ceremonial duties, and altogether humble-minded Christians. Their humility is not all misplaced, for as you see at a glance, poor fellows, that they belong to the lag remove of the human race. If the taking of the cowl does not imply a complete renouncement of the world, it is, at least in these days, although farewell to every kind of useful and entertaining knowledge, and accordingly the low bestial brow and the animal case of those almost bourbon features show plainly enough that all the intellectual vanities of life have been really and truly abandoned. But it is hard to quench altogether the spirit of inquiry that stirs in the human breast. And accordingly these monks inquire. They are always inquiring for news. Poor fellows, they could scarcely have yielded themselves to the sway of any passion more difficult of gratification, for they have no means of communicating with the busy world, except through European travellers, and these, in consequence, I suppose, of that relentlessness and irritability that generally haunt their wanderings, seem to have always avoided the bore of giving any information to their hosts. As for me, I am more patient and good-natured, and when I found that the kind monks who gathered round me at Nazareth were longing to know the real truth about the General Bonaparte, who had recoiled from the siege of Acre, I softened my heart down to the good humor of Herodotus, and calmly began to sing history, telling my eager hearers of the French Empire and the greatness of its glory, and of Waterloo and the fall of Napoleon. Now my story is of this marvelous ignorance on the part of the poor monks, is one upon which, though depending on my own testimony, I took with considerable suspicion. It is quite true how silly it would be to invent anything so witless, and yet I think I could satisfy the mind of a reasonable man. It is false. Many of the older monks must have been in Europe at the time when the Italy and the Spain from which they came were in the act of taking their French lessons, or had parted so lately with their teachers that not to know of the emperor was impossible. And these men could scarcely therefore have failed to bring with them some tidings of Napoleon's career. Yet I say that which I have written is true. The one who believes because I have said it will be right. She always is. Whilst poor Mr. Reasonable Man, who is convinced by the weight of my argument, will be completely deceived. In Spanish politics, however, the monks are better instructed. The revenues of the monasteries, which have been principally supplied by the bounty of their most Catholic majesties, have been withheld since Ferdinand's death, and the interests of these establishments being thus closely involved in the dynasties of Spain, it is not wonderful that the brethren should be little more knowing in Spanish affairs than in other branches of history. Besides, a large proportion of the monks were natives of the peninsula. To these, I remember Messiri's familiarity with Spanish language and character was a source of immense delight. They were always gathering around him, and it seemed to me that they treasured like gold the few Castilian words which he deigned to spare them. The monks do a world of good in their way, and there can be no doubting that previously to the arrival of Bishop Alexander with his numerous young family and his pretty English nursemaids, they were the chief propagandists of Christianity in Palestine. My old friends of the Franciscan convent at Jerusalem some time since gave proof of their goodness by delivering themselves up to the peril of death for the sake of duty. When I was their guest, they were 40, I believe in number, and I don't recollect that there was one of them whom I should have looked upon as a desirable lifeholder of any property to which I might be entitled in expectancy. Yet these 40 were reduced in a few days to 19. The plague was the messenger that summoned them to taste of real death, but the circumstances under which they perished are rather curious. And though I have no authority for the story except the Italian newspaper, I harbor no doubt of its truth, for the facts were detailed with minuteness and strictly corresponded with all I knew of the poor fellows to whom they related. It was about 3 months after the time of my leaving Jerusalem that the plague set his spotted foot on the holy city. The monks felt great alarm. They did not shrink from their duty, but for its performance they chose a plan most sadly well fitted for the bringing down upon them the very death which they were striving to ward off. They imagined themselves almost safe so long as they remained within their walls, but then it was quite needful that the Catholic Christians of the place, who had always looked to the convent for the supply of their spiritual wants, should receive the aids of religion in the hour of death. A single monk therefore was chosen, either by lot or by some other fair appeal to destiny. Being thus singled out, he was to go forth into the plague-stricken city and to perform with exactness his priestly duties. Then he was to return, not to the interior of the convent, for fear of infecting his brethren, but to a detached building, which I remember belonging to the establishment, but at some little distance from the inhabited rooms. He was provided with a bell, and at a certain hour in the morning he was ordered to ring it, if he could. But if no sound was heard at the appointed time, then knew his brethren that he was either delirious or dead, and another martyr was sent for to take his place. In this way 21 of the monks were carried off. One cannot well fail to admire the steadiness with which the dismal scheme was carried through. But if there were any truth in the notion that disease may be invited by a frightening imagination, it is difficult to conceive a more dangerous plan than that which was chosen by these poor fellows. The anxiety with which they must have expected each day the sound of the bell, the silence that reigned instead of it, and then the drawing of the lots, the odds against death being 1 point lower than yesterday's, and going forth of the newly doomed man, all this must have widened the gulf that opens the shades below when his victim had already suffered so much of mental torture. It was but easy work for big, bullying pestilence to follow a forlorn monk from the beds of the dying, wrench away his life from him, as he lay all alone in an outhouse. In most, I believe, in all of the Holy Land convents, there are two personages so strangely raised above their brethren in all their dwelling under the same roof, their worshipping the same God, consistent as all of this with the spirit of their religion, yet strikes the mind with a sense of wondrous incongruity. The men I speak of are Padre Superiore and Padre Missionario. The former is the supreme and absolute governor of the establishment over which he is appointed to rule. The latter is entrusted with the more active of the spiritual duties attaching to the pilgrim church. He is the shepherd of the good Catholic flock, whose pasture is prepared in the midst of the Mussulmans and schismatics. He keeps the light of the true faith ever vividly before their eyes, reproves their vices, supports them in their good resolves, consoles them in their afflictions, and teaches them to hate the Greek church. Such are his labors, and you may conceive that great tact must be needed for conducting with success the spiritual interests of the church under circumstances so odd as those which surround it in Palestine. But the position of the Padre Superiore is still more delicate. He is almost unceasingly entreating the powers that be, in the worldly prosperity of the whole establishment, as in great measures dependent upon the extent of diplomatic skill which he can employ in its favor. I know not from what class of churchmen these personages are chosen, for there is a mystery attending their origin and the circumstance of their being stationed in these convents, which Rome does not suffer to be penetrated. I have heard it said that they are men of great note, and perhaps of too high ambition in the Catholic hierarchy, who have fallen under the grave censure of the Church, are banished for fixed periods to these distant monasteries. I believe that the term during which they are condemned to remain in the Holy Land is from 8 to 12 years by the natives of the country, as well as by the best of the brethren. They are looked upon as superior beings, and rightly too, for nature seems to have crowned them in her own true way. The chief of the Jerusalem convent was a noble creature. His worldly and spiritual authority seemed to have surrounded him, as it were, with a kind of court, and the manly gracefulness of his bearing did honor to the throne he filled. There were no lords of the bedchamber, and no gold sticks and stones in waiting. Yet everybody who approached him looked as though he were being presented. Every interview which he granted wore an air of audience. The brethren, as often as they came near, bowed low and kissed his hand, and if he went out, the Catholics of the place that hovered about the convent would crowd around him with devout affection, and almost scramble for the blessing which his touch could give. He bore his honors all serenely, as though calmly conscious of his power to bind and to loose. And that was the monks of Palestine from Eothen. And I hope you enjoyed episode 97. So, if you found this educational, if you found this entertaining, or if you found it inspiring, would you give me a like, subscribe, and share? And if you have any questions, please leave them down in the comment section below, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Have a good evening, everyone. Good night. Much love to you. And welcome back to Tuesday Reads, and we are continuing on Eothen by Kinglake. This is chapter 11, Galilee. Neither old Sacred himself, nor any of his helpers, knew the road which I meant to take from Nazareth to the Sea of Galilee, and from thence to Jerusalem. So I was forced to add another to my party by hiring a guide. The associations of Nazareth, as well as my kind feeling towards the hospitable monks whose guests I had been, inclined to tell me to set at naught the advice which I had received against employing Christians. I accordingly engaged a live, active young Nazarene, who was recommended to me by the monks, and who affected to be familiar with the line of country through which I intended to pass. My disregard of the popular prejudices against Christians was not justified in this particular instance by the result of my choice. This you will see by and by. I passed by Cana, and the house of the marriage feast prolonged by miraculous wine. I came to the field in which our Saviour had rebuked the Scotch Sabbath keepers of the period by suffering his disciples to pluck corn on the Lord's Day. I rode over the ground where the fainting multitude had been fed, and they showed me some of the massive fragments, the relics, they said, of that wondrous banquet, now turned into stone. The petrification was most complete. I ascended the height where our Lord was standing when he wrought the miracle. The hill rose lofty enough to show me the fairness of the land on all sides, but I have an ancient love for the mere features of a lake. And so, forgetting all else, when I reached the summit, I looked away eagerly to the eastward. There she lay, the Sea of Galilee, less stern than water, less fair than gentle Windermere. She had still the winning ways of an English lake. She caught from the smiling heavens unceasing light and changeful phases of beauty. And with all this brightness on her face, she yet clung fondly to the dull, he-looking mountain at her side, as though she would soothe him with her finer fancies, touch him with her lighter thoughts. If one might judge of men's real thoughts by their writings, it would seem that there are people who can visit an interesting locality and follow up continuously the exact train of thought that ought to be suggested by the historical associations of the place. A person of this sort can go to Athens and think of nothing later than the age of Pericles, can live with the Scipios as long as he stays in Rome. I am not thus docile. It is only by snatches and for a few moments together that I can really associate a place with its proper history. There at Tiberias, and along this western shore towards the north, and upon the bosom too of the lake, our Saviour and his disciples. Away flew those recollections, and my mind strained eastward, because that was the farthest shore, was the end of the world that belongs to man the dweller, the beginnings of the other and veiled world that is held by the strange race, whose life, like the pastime of Satan, is a going to and fro upon the face of the earth. From those grey hills right away to the gates of Baghdad, stretched forth by the mysterious desert, not a pale, void, sandy tract, but a land abounding in rich pastures, a land without cities or towns, without any respectable people or any respectable things, yet yielding its 80,000 cavalry to the beck of the few old men. But once more, Tiberias, the plain of Gennesareth, the very earth on which I stood, that the deep low tones of the Saviour's voice should have gone forth into eternity from our midst of these hills and these valleys. Aye, but yet again, the calm face of the lake was uplifted and smiled upon my eyes with such familiar gaze, that the deep low tones were hushed and the listening multitudes all passed away, and instead there came to me a loving thought from over the seas in England, a thought more sweet than gospel to a wilful mortal like this. I went to Tiberias, and soon got afloat upon the water. In the evening I took up my quarters in the Catholic church, and the building being large enough, the whole of my people were admitted to the benefit of the same shelter. With portmanteaus, and carpet-bags, and books, and maps, and fragrant tea. My Siri soon made me a home on the southern side of the church. One of the old sheriff's helpers was an enthusiastic Catholic, and was greatly delighted at having so sacred a lodging. He lit up the altar with a number of tapers, and when his preparations were complete, he began to perform strange orisons. His lips muttered the prayers of the Latin church, but he bowed himself down and laid his forehead to the stones beneath him, after the manner of a Mussulman. The universal aptness of a religious system for all stages of civilization and for all sorts and conditions of men well benefits its claim of divine origin. She is of all nations and of all times, that wonderful church of Rome. Tiberias is one of the 4 holy cities. The other 3 cities held holy by Jews are Jerusalem, Hebron, and Safet. According to the Talmud, and it is from this place, or the immediate neighborhood of it, that the Messiah is to arise. Except at Jerusalem, never think of attempting to sleep in a holy city. All Jews from all parts of the world go to lay their bones upon the sacred soil, and since these people never return to their homes, it follows that any domestic vermin they may bring with them are likely to become permanently resident, so that the population is continually increasing. No recent census had been taken when I was at Tiberias, but I know that the congregation of fleas, which attended at any church alone, must have been something enormous. It was a carnal, self-seeking congregation, wholly inattentive to the service which was going on, and devoted to the one object of having my blood. The fleas of all nations were there. The smug, steady, and importunate flea from Holy Well Street, the pert, jumping puce from hungry France, the wary, watchful Pulse, with his poisoned stiletto, the vengeful Polga of Castile, with his ugly knife, the German Floch, with his knife and fork, insatiate, not rising from the table, whole swarms from all the Russia and the Asiatic hordes unnumbered, all these were there, and all rejoiced in one great international feast. I could no more defend myself against my enemies than if I had been pain à desecration in the hands of a French communist. After passing a night like this, you are glad to gather up the remains of your body long before morning dawns. Your skin is scorched, your temples throb, your lips feel withered and dried, your burning eyeballs are screwed inward against the brain, and you have no hope, but only in the saddle and the freshness of the morning air. Be right back.
Cotton fields whisper tales of old, under the shadow of a moss-draped oak. Johnny Rep's footsteps, growing cold, far from fire, cannon smoke. Worn-out boots on haunted ground, trudging through the dusky mire. By candlelight, no victory found. Prayers unanswered in the wire. In the heart of Alabama, ghosts walking slow. Confederate soldier, nowhere to go. Battles fought and lost, neath the blood-red glow. In the heart of Alabama, whispers of woe. Magnolias weep in the midnight hour, greycoats drenched in heavy sorrow. Yesteryear's battles, fields devoured, promises of tomorrow, nobody to borrow. Worn-out boots on haunted ground, trudging through the dusky mire. By candlelight, no victory found. Prayers unanswered in the wire. In the heart of Alabama, ghosts walking slow. Confederate soldier, nowhere to go. Battles fought and lost, neath the blood-red glow. In the heart of Alabama, whispers of woe. Magnolias weep in the midnight hour, greycoats drenched in heavy sorrow. Yesteryear's battles, fields devoured, promises of tomorrow, nobody to borrow. Magnolias weep in the midnight hour, greycoats drenched in heavy sorrow. Yesteryear's battles, fields devoured, promises of tomorrow, nobody to borrow. River sings a mourner's tune, iron shackles neath the muddy tide, crimson stains beneath the moon, southern pride swallowed deep inside. In the heart of Alabama, ghosts walking slow. Confederate soldier, nowhere to go. Battles fought and lost, neath the blood-red glow. In the heart of Alabama, whispers of woe.